Alright, so this is our presentation. Our topic is synesthesia and long-term memory, and my name is Nick DeKaiser.
Tyler Bennett.
Vanessa Russin. I'm Jamie Vanderheide.
So a little overview of our presentation. We're going to start with what synesthesia is and go over different types, and then we're going to get into the benefits and the downsides of having synesthesia, and then finally we'll get into the hypothetical study that we proposed based on the literature review, and then the results that we would expect to find based on that study.
Okay, so to begin, the definition of synesthesia is a condition in which ordinary stimuli exhibit extraordinary experiences. Okay, so within the broad topic of synesthesia are subcategories where individuals elicit different experiences based on similar stimuli. The three subcategories of synesthesia that we analyze are grapheme color synesthesia, chromesthesia, and mirror touch synesthesia. So grapheme color synesthesia is described as when an individual's perception of numerals and letters is associated with the experience of color. So no two cases of grapheme color synesthesia are identical, and each individual experiences different sensations when exposed to similar stimuli. The next one is chromesthesia. Chromesthesia is a term of synesthesia in which heard sounds automatically and involuntarily evoke an experience of color. For example, you hear a siren and you experience the color purple simultaneously. Lastly is mirror touch synesthesia, in which a condition that causes individuals to experience a similar sensation in the same part of their body that another person feels. For example, if someone with this condition were to observe someone touching their cheek, they would feel the same sensation on their own cheek.
Alright, so a vast majority of synesthesia research is done with grapheme color synesthesia because that is the most common type. But given this, there have been a lot of cognitive advantages reported for those with grapheme color synesthesia. So one example looked into recognition memory with both those without synesthesia and those with synesthesia, and they found greater memory for written words, nonsense words, scenes, and complex repeating patterns called fractals. Basically, they just gave participants time to study and learn a variety of pictures or words, and then they were given slightly modified, or a mix of slightly modified images with those original ones, and they were much better at recognizing which were the original images. In a second experiment, they used similar images, or they used pictures, but they edited and modified them differently with different colors and different orientations, and different, like some objects were taken out or put in, and they found the same results. They were more accurate at recognizing the original photos. So there's some other memory benefits that have been reported. One study looking at synesthete children who were around 10 to 11 years old were found to have a greater memory span for letter recall. So, and then also one study found that there was greater performance in sensory memory related tasks. Specifically, participants were told to fixate on a single point, and then 8 letters around that center fixation point were briefly presented, and they had to recall one of the letters in a specific position. And they were found to be better at recalling these letters if their perceptual awareness and for the target letter was high. And then also they found the same study with the same synesthete children found that they had quicker processing speeds compared to non-synesthete children. More specifically, this was done with the cancellation task, which involves scanning a variety of pictures and crossing out the target object while ignoring the non-target object. And they found that those with synesthesia were much faster at doing this, and they performed 3 years above average on this test. So one other way that they test synesthesia is through embedded figures tasks, and this involves detecting a small letter or a shape in hidden within a more complex scene. And one study by Rich and Karsoff used a simple version of this and found that the synesthetes were much better at detecting triangles within a hidden scene, but they were not any faster than the non-synesthetes.
So with synesthesia having potential benefits, it unfortunately has its downsides, and one of the downsides is mental health. Carmichael et al. Actually found that grapheme color synesthetes had higher rates of anxiety disorder and obsessive compulsive disorder. So the wonderful thing about having mental health in this type of scenario is that anxiety disorder and grapheme color synesthesia, they actually have correlation due to their altered white matter in the brain. And even though anxiety can affect individuals for their life, it actually is a good thing when they diagnose grapheme color synesthesia as a child, because you can do that. Grapheme color synesthesia can be diagnosed in early childhood, and this can be used as an early biomarker for anxiety disorders that can be diagnosed later in life. Otherwise, another downside to having grapheme color synesthesia, not necessarily grapheme color synesthesia, but just synesthesia in general, is incorrect perceptions. And this occurs when there is a disconnect between stimuluses. And an example that we came up with is, for example, a grapheme color synesthete who might associate the letter A as being a color experience of red. They might also taste watermelon, and this might not sound like a completely bad thing at first, but they might learn to associate that everything that they associate as being red is edible, which can eventually not be a totally good thing. Okay, so when Dixon, Smilik, and Merkel did Stroop-related studies on synesthetes, they found that projector synesthetes unfortunately did worse compared to associator grapheme color synesthetes and the control group. And what they found is that projector synesthetes tend to do poor in these tasks. Projector synesthetes just experience their form of synesthesia in the external space, versus associate color synesthetes, they experience their form of synesthesia in the internal mind, and because of this, there was just conflict when perceiving the Stroop-related tasks. Otherwise, synesthesia does deteriorate with age. In a study done by Simner et al., they had participants ranging from early to late 20s, and most of the grapheme color synesthetes were in their early 20s, and they discovered that grapheme color synesthesia cannot keep up with age due to, with everyone losing their eyesight over time, colors just don't become more intense, they're not more luminescent, and people could once have grapheme color synesthesia when they were younger, could eventually lose it when they get older due to age, unfortunately, too.
Alright, so based on all of this literature, we decided to focus our hypothetical study on the cognitive advantages of having synesthesia. So based on that, we decided to take from the study presented by Rothen et al., which showed an increased sensory memory in participants, which was the one that they were able to better recall the location of a letter presented in a sequence. And it is also based on the Ramachandran study, which found better word recognition in a puzzle. So based on that, we hypothesized that participants with grapheme color synesthesia will have higher scores on a long-term memory test than participants without. We are trying to extend those findings of sensory memory and short-term memory into seeing if there's benefits in the long term. And then we also had a second hypothesis, because a lot of the studies are based on recall and recognition tasks. And the difference is that recall tasks are your basic short answer questions. So you ask a question and you are able to apply that answer right then and there. whereas recognition is identifying the correct answer from a multiple choice. So based on this, our hypothesis is that participants with synesthesia will score better on those recognition or multiple choice tasks, and there will be no significant difference on their recall task. And we hypothesize this because we think people with synesthesia will be able to better identify items in a multiple choice list because they have those color associations, whereas with a short answer question, they might not be able to identify the correct answer because they don't have that association. So our participants will be randomly selected college students aged 18 to 22 from four-year universities, and those with synesthesia will be gathered from some sort of registry or documentation that may or may not exist. Materials are a classroom to administer the test as well as the reading and study time, and then we'll administer the testing materials as well as any special accommodations for those who may need it. We will also provide a story that hopefully will be relatively unknown to each participant based on the rarity of it. And then we will provide a memory test based on that story, which offers 10 multiple choice questions and 10 short answer questions. So the procedure is the participants will come into the classroom and they'll read their story, and then at the conclusion of their time reading, they will be given 30 minutes to try and study and remember as much as they can. They'll be given paper and pencil to try and jot notes down. However, upon leaving the classroom, all the materials will be required to stay in the room so that there will be no studying materials outside other than just kind of trying to remember it in their own heads. And then participants will return after 1 week to take the memory test, which, as I said, is 10 multiple choice and 10 short answer questions based on the content of the story. So results that we would expect to find that would support our hypothesis would be that there would be a significant difference in the overall score. Synesthetes would score higher than non-synesthetes, and they would also score higher on the recognition or multiple choice section as hypothesized, and there would be no significant difference in recall scores based on the previous literature that we found. And then if the results did not support our hypotheses, there would be no significant differences across the board in terms of scores. Synesthetes and non-synesthetes would score the same, and we reason this because potentially synesthesia might not have any effect on long-term memory, and it would just be based solely on their learning techniques and their other cognitive resources used when applying their memory to the test. And based on that leads us into our discussion, where if the hypothesis were to be supported, it extends the research on sensory memory provided by Rothen et al. And it also extends the Ramachandran and Ward studies, which based their research on recall versus recognition tasks. And then based on this study, we do come across some potential limitations.
Okay, so some limitations of this study include, first, participants could have differences in their cognitive learning levels, which could affect their comprehension, memory, and recall of the story given. There also could be a chance that a participant could have some sort of personal connection to the story given, which would easier allow them to recall the story and invalidate their memory ability. And lastly, there could be differences in memory abilities in general aside from synesthesia, and that could affect their recall ability as well. So to further enhance the study, we would modify our actions to gather more accurate and additional data. First, we would have participants take a comprehensive reading and comprehension exam in order to test cognitive abilities and compare data within the set to participants with similar cognitive levels. This would allow us to draw further conclusions about synesthesia more specifically and decrease outside factors affecting the data. And lastly, we thought it would be interesting to test gender differences with this topic as well to see if gender at all plays a role in the effects of synesthesia and its connection with long-term memory. Thank you for listening.
If you have any questions, just leave them in the comments.